and it will be available later on our YouTube channel. If you have questions, put them in the chat box or save them till the end of the presentation. I think Josh and I are kind of doing a conversational approach today, and we hope you enjoy it. Again, this is Plain Talk, presented by Pro 15 and sponsored by Colorado REA. Our topic this morning is rural health care, and our presenter is Josh Neff, who is the Vice President of Integration and Rural Health for Centura Health. He leads an amazing team of rural healthcare CEOs, finance and operation execs at managed hospitals in their rural markets. They span 17 hospitals, 13 affiliate hospitals, health neighborhoods, health at home, hospice and palliative care, urgent care centers, and emergency rooms, and mountain clinics with more than 6,000 physicians and 100 plus physician practices and clinics, and Flight for Life Colorado. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Josh, and maybe we'll start out this morning, Josh, with having you just tell us a little bit more about yourself and some of the work that you're doing in the rural hospital arena.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kathy. It's a pleasure to be here with you and the folks with Pro 15. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'd like for it to be just that, a conversation. So as we're kind of walking through things, feel free to ask the questions or shoot Kathy the question through the chat box. I want to make sure that we cover all the ground that we need to, and that everybody feels comfortable about the subject matter. So I've been with Centura Health for about 3 years. Just a little over 2 years ago, I moved into this role of system integration and rural health. And I usually have to make the declaration, it's system integration, not systems integration. So I have zero to do with IT, which is always fun because somehow I've gotten, my title has gotten me added to some sales lists. And so I get 3 or 4 phone calls a day about, hey, can we talk to you about IT infrastructure and web platforms and all that good stuff? And I'm the wrong person to talk to about that. So I have kind of 2 roles. I help with the integration work of our merger and acquisition plan. And so bringing folks into a nonprofit faith-based organization has its own set of unique challenges. And so I have the opportunity to lead some of that work from a cultural renovation and restoration and transformation perspective. The lion's share of what I do is lead our rural health initiatives. And so we've got, as Kathy mentioned, we actually have 16 affiliated hospitals through Western Kansas and Greater Colorado. And I'll toggle over here in a minute. I've got some maps and stuff to show you guys. So we've got a number of rural clinical affiliated hospitals as well as managed hospitals. These are all mostly small critical access hospitals in rural or frontier communities. So it's really an important part of our mission to build a connected ecosystem and drive whole person care and extend access to care to some of our most vulnerable populations. So it's an interesting and unique role. We are a metro-based. Most folks assume that we're just a metro-based organization, and while our corporate office is in Denver, our roots are actually in the rural market. 139 years ago, 5 women religious were sent to a small mining town in southern Colorado called Durango to build a hospital and to build a school and to provide health care for a bunch of rough and rowdy miners. And those women religious did it 139 years ago. We still have a connected ministry in that market and continue to provide care for folks all through the Four Corners region and down into the Ute reservations in northern New Mexico. So we've been doing rural healthcare for a long time. A little bit about me personally. I've been in healthcare since I was 19 years old. I started as an EMT and then was a paramedic, and then flew on the helicopter for Care Flight Dallas as a paramedic for a long time. paid my way through college. I didn't do your traditional, I'm the super smart kid that finished their bachelor's degree in 3 years and a master's degree in 18 months. Took me a lot longer. I worked full time doing direct hands-on patient care. I grew up in a really small town in deep South Texas on the border, working ranch family. We didn't have a neighbor that was real close. The nearest neighbor to that, to our gate, was 8 miles away. So I really understand what life in the rural markets is all about. That said, I thoroughly enjoyed the blend of my ability to reach out and travel into our rural markets and interface with those folks and be connected. And I also really enjoy the fact that I live in Castle Rock and I've got a King Soopers about 3/4 of a mile away, so that when I've got to run for one stick of butter for something, it doesn't take me half a day to do it. But so there's a couple things I want to cover today. One, which is going to be really important, is kind of life after COVID for rural healthcare providers, rural markets. How some of the things, as some of you may have heard Kathy and I talking as we kind of kickstarted this, around what's going on today at the Capitol in terms of testifying against on the topic of our public option and how that could potentially have some challenges. And then really digging into philosophically what it's going to take for rural hospitals to not only thrive, but survive in the, excuse me, in the out years. And that's a real challenge. There are far more cultural issues that get in the way with that journey than there are operational issues. And as we say, culture eats strategy and operations for lunch. And so it's not necessarily a quick fix. So we'll get started. Any questions so far? Any questions on me, my background, Centura, anything of that nature before we kick off? Kathy, would you let me share my screen real quick?
Did that work?
Perfect, it did.
Okay. I'm getting better at this.
Yeah. Well, listen, we're over a year into these Zoom meetings and I still have trouble like figuring out how to get off mute and all that good stuff. So I just wanted to share a couple maps with you as it relates to kind of what rural healthcare really looks like. So this is a map of Colorado, and can you see my pointer moving, Kathy?
Yes.
So this is a map of Colorado. Obviously, this is Western Kansas, a little bit of a tip of Nebraska. And so you can see that the majority of the hospitals in Colorado are located along the Front Range on the 25 corridor. They're scattered about the western slope, but that even looks different from the eastern plains of Colorado and even through the southern third of the state. If you look at this county or these counties down in the north or the southwest region of Colorado, you can see we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 large counties that actually don't have a hospital resource. This is a bit of a topographical map. So the darker green indicates really tall mountain peaks. So imagine having to try to access healthcare in those regions. When you look at the eastern plains, you've got a number of large counties that also don't have a hospital resource, but that the resources are actually spread out and they're a good distance from the Denver metro, and that creates significant problems. So Morgan County, you guys are basically about 85 miles to downtown Denver, but that's a really long 85 miles when you're talking about the delivery of healthcare and how do we work to keep healthcare local in those communities. At Centura, we believe the best care is delivered local when clinically appropriate and possible. And so we're actually coming up with some strategies around how we continue to support those folks. Now, interestingly, if you look at Western Kansas, it looks vastly different. Looks like there's a lot of hospitals in Western Kansas, and there are. These are all Hill-Burton era hospitals from the 50s and 60s. Each square county has got a red circle in it for the most part. But here's what I want to show you. So this is the map of Kansas. Each one of these yellow dots is a critical access hospital. These are 25 beds and under. The majority of these hospitals actually staff for 10 beds and under. And if they're lucky, they've got an average daily census of 1 to 2. If you look at where healthcare resources are, this is the center of the state, and you've only got 2 hospitals that are 100 beds and over, and those are those are really like 105 beds is all. So there are some significant challenges when you look at the totality of rural healthcare and the differences between the two. So the same economic challenges exist for the most part in these critical access hospitals along the Eastern Plains, as do many other states. Iowa, the map of Iowa looks very similar to the map of Kansas. Square counties, one red hospital in the middle, and that can create some interesting and unique challenges. So by comparison, and while I absolutely recognize that this is Pro 15 and that represents Northeast Colorado, we at Centura provide rural health in both states. I just want to show this comparison. So there's 29 critical access hospitals in Colorado. We're actually doing a little bit better because Colorado expanded Medicaid. Kansas has not expanded Medicaid. And coming out of COVID, there are 72 hospitals, critical access hospitals in Kansas that are in imminent risk of closure. That will have significant impact in healthcare, but it'll also have significant impact in the economies in those small towns. As with Colorado, right? Your critical access hospital is typically your number one or number two employer in the county or the region, usually followed by school board or county itself. And when you lose your number one or number two employer in the county, some of these small communities can actually just die. And so we understand that the delivery of healthcare in those communities is far more important than just simply how do we put Band-Aids on cuts and how do we do chest x-rays and things of that nature. So as I mentioned, some of the challenges around coming out of COVID, COVID's had a significant impact on us. This slide is a little bit dated. It's pre-COVID, but we now have greater than 120 hospitals that have closed, critical access rural hospitals that have closed since 2010. Significant numbers of community jobs, lots of impact from an economic perspective. And as you can see, there's an additional 673 across the country that are at risk. These critical access hospitals do well to have a 1 or 2% margin if they're lucky. The majority of hospitals in these small communities simply don't have a margin. So figuring out how to thrive and survive in this economy is going to be a big challenge. Let's talk a little bit about what the world looks like with COVID. This is a very different experience in the rural market around COVID than what we had in the urban markets and suburban markets. March of last year, Centura had the first COVID patient, the first confirmed COVID patient in the state of Colorado in our Summit, St. Anthony's Summit Hospital out by Breckenridge. In April, the governor shut down elective surgeries, or what we call time-sensitive surgeries, and that has had a significant impact on hospitals across the Front Range. Interestingly, it was probably another 6 months or so before we really started getting impacted with COVID patients in these rural markets. Now that said, the impact of COVID had a significant impact on us. Although we weren't seeing a lot of COVID patients, volumes across the board dropped by 85% on average in rural critical access hospitals. So this is a significant financial event for these organizations. When you're talking about rural critical access hospitals or cost-based reimbursement, the majority of their patients are Medicare or Medicaid. If you combine Medicare and Medicaid, you're generally anywhere north of 65 and in some cases up to 80% of your payer mix. You layer on another 5 to 7% of self-pay, and the rest, if you're lucky, is your Blue Cross Blue Shield, United, Aetna, those folks. And even those payers don't do great in the rural market simply because those rural hospitals aren't really able to have much negotiating power with those folks. So all across the board, it's a challenge from an economic perspective to make a margin and to use that margin to reinvest in the community needs. So we saw this significant drop in volumes across the board. The majority of those hospitals worked diligently to try to flex their staffing. But as you know, in a rural hospital, You may not just be the director of maintenance. You may also have about 6 other hats that you wear. The CEO is never just the CEO. Your clinic nurse probably doubles as your infection control nurse, is also may do some of your PR and marketing, because that's how we do it in the rural markets. So there were significant operational hurdles to figure out how to address that came with a significant decrease in that volume. We started to see those COVID patients pick up sporadically kind of through the late summer and then early fall. I had one county that I have a managed critical access hospital in, was in the top 25 counties in the country for our positivity rate, north of 60% positivity rate. Yet our volumes were still really low. Those COVID patients who were really sick would come into the ER and then immediately get flown out to one of the larger hospitals, because we simply just didn't have the capacity to care for those patients. Lots of patients needed just kind of the standard COVID care protocol, which we were able to keep them in our community, but we weren't keeping many of those patients in the hospital. Now, despite all that, we had to try to prepare for a massive COVID influx. And so we had to spend some dollars on turning regular rooms into negative pressure rooms and cordoning off halls to make a quote COVID unit so that we could better care for these patients. PPE supplies became a significant challenge because those were all going to the major metropolitan areas. I think Centura, in addition to the other large systems in town, did a relatively good job of pushing PPE back out to some of our rural partners. I got a number of calls where, you've got a critical access hospital in the Eastern Plains of Colorado who has one general surgeon, and that general surgeon basically covers everything. I got a call from one of those CEOs that said, I have actually 2 sterile gowns left in the entire house. So if we use those, we can't take care of any more patients. So how can you help us? And so we were able to get them actually a couple cases. The good news is their surgeon's like myself, he's a pretty sizable guy. And so he needed a 3X sterile gown, which is not the standard. So we actually had a good surplus of those 3X surgical gowns. And so we were able to get some of those out. If he had been kind of a normal sized human being, I don't know that we would have had as much success getting him what he needed. So there's sometimes a little benefit to being a sizable human being, as those of us say. So lots of things that created uncertainty. It was not only the economic uncertainty, it was the uncertainty around, what is COVID? Is this thing true? Is it a hoax? I still have communities, because they're, staunchly independent and are not they don't lean into those governmental relationships like other communities do, that still are struggling with the fact that there's questions around, is this the flu? Is this a hoax? Is this a government thing? And that's really impeded our ability to drive care. I just looked at financials for all 5 of my managed hospitals across Colorado and Kansas. Volumes are still off significantly. ED volumes are still off by about 25%. We expect that to continue. Clinic volumes are off anywhere from about 5% in some markets to north of 60% in some markets. And in those regions, those ED volumes are what actually drive your inpatient volumes as well. So lots going on, and there's a significant amount of unknown. Other challenges that have surfaced for us as it relates to the COVID pandemic are interesting and driven by culture. I've got one critical access hospital so far that they have only been able to get 7% of their associates vaccinated. That's all in the entire organization that are interested in having the COVID vaccine. My highest group is 52%, and everybody else kind of falls in between 30 and about 45. But to think about, to think of a healthcare organization that struggles with even getting double-digit percentages of their healthcare providers vaccinated really speaks to the culture in that community. Interestingly, we're actually starting to see some vaccine bias. That bias is related to patients asking if their caregivers are vaccinated. If they're not, some have expressed an interest in having a caregiver that's vaccinated. Just in the community, I had a conversation about a week ago, and one of my associates who I knew had been vaccinated, we were having a conversation with some community members, and one of the community members said, "Hey, were you one of the sheep that got the vaccine?" And that associate went, "Nope, not me." And so after our conversation, I was like, "Well, I thought you had your vaccine." He said, "I do, but I'm not putting it out there because I don't want to be ridiculed in the community and called a sheep and made fun of and, all of that good stuff." He said, "I did it. I believe that it's what's going to help keep us, safe. I don't know if it works for me or not, but I did it because I felt that was the best thing for our organization and our community." So it's interesting that we're seeing some of those types of conversations and comments pop up. So there's a lot more than just the financial pressures. What I will say is there's a little bit of a misnomer around where the rural hospitals and all hospitals, but specific to this conversation, where the rural hospitals are coming out of COVID, given all the CARES Act dollars, the Medicare advance payment, the payroll protection dollars, the PPP. Many of the PPP dollars have been forgiven. Those are typically around $1 million, $1.5 million for these small hospitals. And so if you look at the balance sheet and the financials of these hospitals, some of them are sitting on $8 or $10 million of spare cash. Their days cash on hand are inflated because of that. The challenge is, so if you just look across the board at everybody's financials, you go, gosh, you got millions of dollars in the bank that you're sitting on. The challenge is we don't know what we can spend that on and what's going to be allowable. There are a number of hospitals that have spent all of their CARES Act dollars. My gut is that a significant portion of those CARES Act dollars that they spent are not going to be forgiven based on what they spent them on. They spent them on guidance that HHS gave us early on in June. And then in July, the guidance changed. And then in August, the guidance changed. And then in October, the guidance changed. And so what people spent on in June, where HHS said, "We think you can probably spend money on this," they've now revised their position and said, "Well, you can't spend it on that and give it forgiven, but you can spend it on these things." And so we're fortunate in Centura that the majority of our managed hospitals have not spent a single penny of our HHS CARES dollars. And we intend to have to write that money, write a check back to the federal government for those dollars. Here's the other interesting thing to me. It's a bit of a head scratcher. So I've got a hospital that's got about $10.2 million sitting in a restricted bank account. They've had that money for the better part of about 9 months, and it's in an interest-bearing account. The government is going to require that we only can keep $500 of the interest earned on that account, and every other penny of interest plus the principal has to be returned to the government if it's not forgiven. So there's a challenge in that if we put them in the right accounts, the right investment accounts, we could have potentially grown a pretty good little nest egg, but now we only get to keep $500 of it. So we're going to see, coming out of COVID, my gut is we're going to see a significant number of hospitals struggle and be faced with significant issues around what the future looks like operationally. So it looks like there was Kurt asked the question, does the urban market have a higher vaccination rate of healthcare workers? And they do. And Nicole, if the number's on top of your head, please feel free to correct me. I want to say that it's Centura. So we have 21,000 associates at Centura. And I think that if I remember correctly, across the board, around 65 or plus, give or take, percentage of our associates are vaccinated, but north of 80%, 85% of our providers, so physicians, nurse practitioners, PAs, those folks are vaccinated. And so if you trust your providers and you trust the science, I think the Centura folks are demonstrating that it's safe to get and encourage folks to get that. I do know that in a number of other larger systems, they're kind of seeing the same numbers, but we're just not seeing that same early adoption in the rural markets. In fact, my two Kansas hospitals sent a note to the Kansas Department of Health last week and said, please don't send us any more vaccine allocation because we've exhausted our entire list of people who want to have the vaccine. And so we don't have arms to put it in. And I'd say we're maybe 33 to 35% of the community in that region has been vaccinated. So there's some significant cultural challenges. Let me stop there and see if anybody's got additional thoughts or questions on kind of the COVID piece of stuff.
I was going to mention that, first of all, I'm the president of Morgan Community College, and I have been sitting on pretty religiously with what has been monthly calls of the Northeast Colorado Health Department around COVID response. And it just gives each of the counties, I think there's 5 counties in the health district, a chance to talk about their challenges, and hospitals and long-term care facilities and whatnot are usually on the call. And as vaccine has rolled out, the person who coordinates the call had mentioned that he was talking with one of the ambulance districts out in one of the small communities. And every one of the people in the ambulance company were saying, absolutely not, we're not going to get a COVID vaccine. And I thought, I mean, these are people who are very likely going to be transporting a patient who has COVID to the front lines or to the front range for healthcare. And like, it just doesn't make any sense to me that they're not going to, but it is absolutely a cultural issue. I asked the question about the urban market, not being surprised by the response that it is higher than what the rural market is. I also sit on the board of a long-term care facility that has really been challenged to try to get the number of staff vaccinated and the percentage of the team vaccinated, and just recently implemented we were weighing between, do we give people $100? Do we give them a day off? And we actually ended up giving them 2 days off that they could use in the event that they became sick from the vaccine. And what a lot of people were saying was that I don't want to get sick from the vaccine. And it's pretty common that people feel a little bit crummy, at least for a day or so, some longer than that, and then have to use their own leave, use up their own leave in terms of staying at home because they wouldn't be allowed in the workplace with a low-grade fever, et cetera, et cetera. And that has made an immediate difference, and they're able to start doing clinics and getting that number increased. So I think it takes a little bit of creativity about how to get that number up in people. We're doing clinics for our staff. We had a clinic on Monday. We have the vaccine bus that's going to be here tomorrow. Just trying to do as much as we can, even to get our own staff vaccinated, and of course have some that will probably never get vaccinated. But that is will cause us a delay in having people return and being able to continue to serve students in a face-to-face environment as well. Sorry for my long-winded response.
No, I think, one, I love that creative thinking piece. And I think that's exactly, to a large degree, some of what we have to do. It's interesting. So even in the rural markets, as an example, there was a particular county health nurse who was working with the sheriff's department and the jail to provide everybody their vaccinations. And so they had set up, and this is when they were doing Pfizer, so 2 shots. They had set up everybody. She was just going to go inoculate everybody on the same day. And I said, well, given the number of folks that are having reactions and feel a little cruddy, in 21 days, we're going to go back and give every single jailer in the house a COVID vaccine. And then 4 hours later, a whole bunch of those folks are going to feel really terrible and want to go home. And so how does that, we don't have to worry about that in the Denver metro area, because you've got people on call, you bring them in. But, when you've got 6 jailers in the entire county and 3 of them are on duty and 2 of them get sick that afternoon, I mean, that could potentially be a public safety issue, right? I mean, there are some unique aspects of the vaccine distribution in the rural markets, and that we just don't have in the in the urban markets. So, in fact, I'm doing an hour and a half long conversation around the ethics of rural vaccine efficacy, distribution efficacy, and one of the topics we're talking about is, a lot of rural hospitals started putting shots in whatever arm was available long before the governor started to release some of those things and include other people. Because at the end of the day, if you've got 3 shots left in your vial and it's going to go bad, we're putting it in an arm, right? If we've got a willing participant that wants it stuck in their arm, we're going to put it in their arm. And I think to a large degree, most of that was very covert. But we're having some really robust ethical decisions around, okay, well, the 22-year-old that was home on spring break, who's, fit, works out, runs, all that good stuff, should we be putting that dose in that arm? And my personal opinion, not likely, I'm not representing Centura in this piece of it, but my personal opinion is absolutely the more people we get vaccinated, the quicker we return to normal and move on about our business. The other interesting piece is folks are talking about, well, see, I had COVID already, and so I've got herd immunity. And the challenge is we don't actually have a test that will determine the titer level, right? And so just because you've had COVID, your titer level may be low, you may be just right for herd immunity. What we do know with the vaccine is when we administer that vaccine and then the second dose, we know what your titer levels should be after that. And so there's a little bit of a misnomer around, well, I don't need the vaccine because, I had COVID back in December and, I'm in good shape. And so there's just a lot, and there's a lot around the conversation, and it amplifies in the rural markets. Nicole, you just put a question there. Do you have a question?
I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned about staffing levels and how you have to really be thoughtful about the administration of of the vaccine. How, and I'm sorry if you've touched on this before, but how has COVID exacerbated current staffing challenges in rural healthcare?
Yeah, it's really been a challenge because, as you know, the majority of these hospitals are kind of they're on a shoestring staffing budget for the most part. We don't have flex pool with 100 people in it like we do at Centura and UC Health and Health One. That's why if the clinic nurse gets sick, gosh, we're in a bit of a pinch. And so setting up community kind of drive-through vaccine clinics and that kind of stuff has literally been an all hands on deck approach. We've worked hand in hand with our county health nurses and our county health departments. We've worked hand in hand with local EMS. We've pulled folks out of retirement. We've got folks given shots that probably normally in the course of their normal day don't give shots, but they've been trained to give shots. So it's really been kind of an all hands on deck, but it has been a challenge. When we first opened up our COVID vaccines to folks outside of the 4 walls of the hospital, there was a bit of a surge because all of those folks that wanted the vaccine came to get the vaccine. And so kind of on the front end, it was a significant challenge. But then as that has kind of waned down and we're at the end of our distribution lists, our waiting lists, it's become a lot easier to manage, and we've got a little bit more refined system, but it definitely had an impact on us from a workflow and efficiency perspective. And then you add on top of it all the unknowns of how do I really get that? How is this really transmitted? And you've got all the doffing and donning of the PPE, so putting on and taking off all the PPE, and how do you clean and sterilize after each patient? I mean, the psychological impact of the work related to distributing the vaccine, from what I'm hearing, was an even greater hurdle to overcome than the actual work of giving the vaccine, just because there were so many unknowns and fear. We have incredible care providers in those communities where, despite their fear, they were going to go out there and put vaccines in arms and risk getting it themselves to make sure that their communities were safe and their people were safe. So yeah, thank you for that. Any other thoughts or questions before we kind of move on to the thrive versus survive part of the conversation?
That was my next question. So we're right on track.
Good. So there is a difference between a rural hospital just surviving and a rural hospital thriving. Rural hospitals are typically supported by not only the volume and revenue that comes in from their patient care. The majority of rural critical access hospitals are quasi-governmental agencies or special tax districts. And so there is a mill levy tax or some form of tax dollar that is distributed to the hospital each year. And then there's this thing called 340B pharmacy, which is a program that allows hospitals to collaborate with pharmacies and pharmaceutical distributors, and they get money for doing so and using certain drugs, and that's an important piece of the revenue. With tax dollars and 340B revenue, the majority of critical access hospitals are still operating at a loss. They may have a little bit of a loss, they may have a significant loss, but very few are actually operating with a margin. And so our challenge is, how do we figure out how to get these staunchly independent critical access hospitals, who typically have staunchly independent CEOs. The community is not big on having the big city tell them what to do, and those hospital leaders are typically in rural critical access hospitals versus big systems for a reason, because that's what they like. And so getting small hospitals to think about how to partner and collaborate in meaningful ways is a significant challenge. We have to figure out ways to drive operational efficiency. We need every single dollar that we can get in the rural hospital. And that is a significant challenge relative to community culture, what the community expects of their hospital. Every community wants a couple doctors, and we just can't afford doctors anymore. And so we have to think about, how do we have a physician and some PAs and some nurse practitioners, and how do we utilize our advanced practice providers in a way that's meaningful, but that is within the fiduciary requirements of our goals in the organization, and what just naturally makes sense for us to be good stewards of every single dollar that we get. So there's some ways to achieve that. We are, and my goal is not to turn this into a Centura commercial, but I'm just going to speak to some of my experience with our managed hospitals. We're doing some pretty unique things with our managed hospitals. We are looking at shared resources. So with hospitals in a particular region, how can we share nurses? How can we share techs? And how do we share leaders? There are a lot of critical access hospitals that have a CEO, a COO, a chief nursing officer, a chief financial officer, all of these things. And these are all highly compensated roles. But at the end of the day, given where we're at with healthcare and inpatient care in the rural market, I don't necessarily believe that they all need that. Some likely do, because there's some complexities, right? I mean, look, if you look at Ray Hospital, they've got a ton of procedural work. They're sitting in pretty good shape from a financial perspective. And even though they're a small hospital, they've got some layers of complexity there. And so they may need some of those layers from a leadership perspective. As an example, my two hospitals in Northwest Kansas, we have flattened the leadership team. We have one CEO over both hospitals. We have a regional CFO over 3 hospitals. So we've elevated some of our line level and manager and director staff in their positions, but we don't need a chief financial officer at each one of those small critical access hospitals. We need a good, strong controller that helps oversee. We need rock solid director of finance and financial analysts to help put together that book of work. but we don't need a high level CFO, ethereal thinking, kind of keeping their thumb on the pulse of all things that are going on from the federal government perspective. What we're able to do is by combining that role into a regional CFO position between 3 hospitals, we actually can, that elevates the salary and compensation a bit, which attracts a little bit different CFO into that market, which also, by the way, means that they're spending those extra salary dollars in those rural markets. But if you take that salary and divide it by 3, it's 60% less than each of those individual hospitals were spending on their CFO previously. So it's not a blanket approach. I mean, I think you have to look at each one of those opportunities individually. But how do we to some degree compress our leadership teams a little bit? A lot of them are top heavy, and there's significant dollars there. Reinvest those dollars in the bottom line of the organization. Figure out how to partner with folks so that we can get additional specialty services into the market. I'm going to share again, Kathy. So these are the areas where we're doing specialty outreach through the Eastern Plains and into parts of Colorado or in parts of Kansas. So what we are aspiring to do, and so Burlington is a managed hospital, Goodland is a managed hospital, Atwood's a managed hospital, Hugo is a clinical affiliate, and Cheyenne Wells is a clinical affiliate. We're actually starting to figure out how to share staff across the state line because it's a compact state. Board of Nursing allows us to do that. 25 minutes between Goodland and Burlington, about 50 minutes down from Burlington to Hugo. We're looking at how do we share some director level folks between these 2 organizations and elevate what we're doing. More importantly though, if we're taking orthopedics to Burlington, each one of these arrows represents a specialty physician who the majority of the time Centura is putting on a plane and flying out into these rural communities. Now that said, Centura can't afford to take an orthopedic surgeon to Burlington and to Goodland and to Oakley and to Atwood. One, the outreach clinics just don't make sense financially because of the number of patients that you see and the time required to travel. But it's an important part of our mission, which is why we engage in it. That said, what we're doing is, so we'll take orthopedics to Burlington. Goodland patients may have to drive 25 minutes over to see the orthopedic doc there. But the agreement between Burlington and Goodland is that Burlington, if they're seeing a Goodland patient and that orthopedic doctor orders a regular x-ray of your knee and then an MRI of your knee and some blood work, Burlington is going to send that patient back to Goodland for those ancillary procedures because there are dollars involved in that. Likewise, cardiology is coming to Goodland. The mutually beneficial relationship here is that Burlington can send their cardiology patients to Goodland. And when that cardiologist orders a chest x-ray, labs, and a stress test, that patient is sent back to Burlington to their home location to get that. These are ways that we're really starting to try to be proactive and think really creatively about how do we provide the best level of care that we can. Now, on the Eastern Plains of Colorado, a number of these hospitals, Sedgwick, Haxton, Melissa, Yuma, Ray, Lincoln, Eads, Cheyenne Wells, so Eads is Wisebroad, in Southeast Colorado Hospital District. There are 10 or 11 of these little hospitals that have pulled together and built a consortium. They're a 501c3 consortium. And they're doing a lot of really good work. They're early on in their journey, but they're really trying to figure out how do we collaborate as a group of rural critical access hospitals and start to think more like a system. That's the important piece. The days of being staunchly independent and having a cowboy as a CEO or cowgirl as a CEO kind of are long gone if we're really going to drive long-term sustainability. So I'm fortunate that I have relationships and have had some conversations just recently. Last Monday, I was an all-day strategic planning retreat with the Eastern Plains Healthcare Consortium, and their struggles are real, right? The impact of this public option is significant for them. And so they're trying to figure out ways that they can come together as a small system and elevate the level of care along the Eastern Plains, as well as elevate long-term financial sustainability and building process and systems whereby they can thrive in their markets. Here's a great example. The state of Colorado doesn't allow collective bargaining for small rural hospitals. So if Centura calls up Blue Cross Blue Shield and says, hey, we want to talk about our rates for these given things. And by the way, we've got 17 sponsor-owned hospitals, 22,000 associates. We cover, we care for millions of patients a year. And so that gives us a bit of the upper hand in the negotiation. When Yuma picks up the phone and calls Blue Cross Blue Shield, they're lucky if the computer even answers the phone. If they can get somebody on the phone, it's never a negotiation, because Yuma is probably, I'm just going to make a guess, they're probably a $17 to $20 million a year little hospital. Blue Cross Blue Shield isn't really interested in having those negotiations. United, I'm not just picking on Blue Cross Blue Shield, United, Aetna. These markets don't represent enough covered lives that they have a significant interest. Now, that said, Blue Cross Blue Shield is the primary provider through the Eastern Plains. They do have conversations with us. They're working with us collaboratively to educate us on how to approach them in some of these conversations. So they're giving us a little bit of a peek inside, if you will. But one of the things we're working on is potentially getting some of our state representatives and elected officials to carry a bill for us that allows those 10 hospitals to come together under a collective bargaining agreement, which gives them a more powerful seat at the table with the commercial payers. So that when the phone rings, when the phone call is made to Blue Cross Blue Shield, it's, hey, this is Eastern Plains Healthcare Consortium. We represent the entire eastern third of the state of Colorado and 10, 11, 12 hospitals as a microsystem. And we'd like to have a conversation with you. That changes the landscape tremendously. Kansas allows that. You can have a consortium that does collective bargaining in Kansas, but they also haven't passed Medicaid. So it's a little bit of a give or take on either side of that state line. But those are some of the things that most people don't understand have a significant impact in a rural market. If you look at, take for example, Lincoln Community Hospital in Hugo. Kevin Stansberry is the CEO. He's probably got 150-ish FTEs. So not only can he not really negotiate really good benefits for him because he's considered a small group, it's difficult for him to negotiate the payer contracts as well. If you take a look at all of those hospitals across the Eastern Plains, now you're probably looking a couple thousand employees, and that's a different conversation with an employee benefits plan. That's a different conversation with a commercial payer. So there's some really interesting and unique challenges that a lot of people don't necessarily take into consideration. Our goal is to not create complete dependency in those markets from Centura's perspective and with Eastern Plains. There's a level of interdependence that's probably the sweet spot that makes sense from an operational perspective and a collaboration perspective. Each of these individual hospitals need to maintain to some degree, a level of independence. But if they're not thinking about how they come together and collaborate, all ships rise on the incoming tide. And that's unless you're stuck on an island out in the middle of nowhere. The rising tide leaves you stranded on that island. So it's important for those folks to think about that. From a transformational leadership and cultural perspective, it was really interesting for me to sit through their all-day board retreat, because as much as they're leaning in, you can still see the struggle and the pull of staunch independence for a number of these CEOs, because their main goal is, hey, listen, I represent my county, I represent Cheyenne County and my hospital, or I represent Wisebroad in Kiowa County, and I'm responsible for doing what's best for us. And what's best for us is collaboration, but they're also really concerned about them specifically. So some interesting things that come out there. Another piece that's really important to these hospitals is swing beds, and making sure that the patients that they do send into the big city need to get back out to these communities as soon as they're able. We're working diligently to make sure that all the systems, but certainly it's a priority for us at Centura, that swing bed patient, 22 days in your swing bed. So a swing bed is basically kind of you can take a hospital bed and convert it to a rehab bed. And when you convert it, that's really just on paper. You're not moving furniture around or doing anything special. It's just a coding thing on the back end. But for a critical access hospital, the government has said, hey, you can take that regular inpatient bed and you can bring a rehab bed or rehab patient back and you can do their inpatient rehab for them. So that patient that might leave Haxton that goes up to Boulder or into Denver for their hip replacement can come back sooner and get their inpatient rehab there. That swing bed patient is worth around $20,000 for the critical access hospital. That's huge dollars. Those are significant opportunities for revenue. So what we want to do is when those patients come into the big systems, oftentimes they get lost in the system. Case management gets involved. They send them 3 blocks away over to Brookdale or Skyline or something like that. They do their 22 days of rehab there, and then they take them back home. And so what we're working on from a rural perspective is making sure that the hospitals in the big city trust us in the rural market to take care of those patients in the right way. Hip replacements, knee replacements, the rehab on those is really important. And an inadequate or misguided rehab can really have a negative impact on those patients. And so we're working to build care collaboratives where our orthopedic surgeons are coming out to the rural market and meeting with the physical therapy teams and saying, hey, when you get my patient back, here's my treatment protocol. I want you to do all these things. And by the way, call me if you have a problem. And we build that rapport and build that trust. Another great way for us to drive those dollars back into the rural community. And at the end of the day, getting those people back home is what's best for them. You take somebody from a county that's got 7,000 people and you plop them at, Porter or St. Anthony's or Sky Ridge or someplace where there's 7,000 people in the first square mile around the hospital, can be a bit of an experience. I laugh. One of my board members has had to bring some family members into Denver, and he said, I pulled up. I was on the executive team at Porter Hospital before I made the transition over to corporate. He said, I pulled up to your hospital in my flatbed diesel pickup truck that had a hay fork on the back of it, and I was going to have them valet park it, and they weren't sure what to do with it. So I had to help them figure out where to park my truck. It's like, well, yeah, we don't often get a 3/4 ton flatbed with a hay fork on the back of it, but we're happy to have you in. And so those are the things that create those mental challenges that are so important to the overall healing of those patients. So we're working on a process to get those folks back out and cared for in the local community. And listen, when you're in an agricultural county and it's September and you're drilling wheat, the last thing that you have time to do is drive 3 hours into town for your 40-minute knee appointment to drive 3 hours back out. You've lost an entire day drilling wheat. Or you've got rain coming tomorrow, and so you got to get hay up, or you got to get corn cut and all that good stuff. And so there are some nuances, and we're working diligently to try to push that along.
Josh, we're out of time. I mean, this is
Right.
a fascinating discussion. And I had heard some of this from Kevin Stansberry down at Hugo. And I know the Pro 15 board, we had just a little discussion about collective bargaining on services, and we'll follow up with that if they find somebody to sponsor it. But we thank you very much for your time today. Thank everybody else for being on the call. here it's blowing about 27 miles an hour and no moisture in sight, but hopefully you all can have a great weekend and we will talk to you all later.
Thanks,
Thank you, Josh.
Kathy. Thanks, everybody,
Kathy.
for joining.